Good morning, one and all present on this online platform today. It is said that don't limit your challenges, challenge your limits, create your own sunshine. With this thought in mind, I, Ravi Krishan, Assistant Professor, Anand Pharmacy College, welcome you all to the day 4 of AICT Training and Learning Academy sponsored e-faculty development program on design thinking principle in pharma product development, a fresh look towards innovation, organized by Anand Pharmacy College, Anand. Today, we will be having sessions from very three eminent speakers, Dr. Ashutosh Jani, Head Clinical Operation Department, Vida Clinical Research, Ahmedabad, Professor Manjari Kaharas, Vice President, International Pharmaceutical Federation, Vice President and Chairperson, Community and Pharmacy Division, Indian Pharmaceutical Association, India, and Professor Vaishali Thakkar, Professor and Head of Pharmaceutics Department, Anand Pharmacy College, Anand. With this, we are now going to start with our very first session. To deliver the session, we have here with us Dr. Ashutosh Jani. To introduce him and to invite him to deliver the session, I now request Dr. Tejal Gandhi to please invite him, ma'am. Please, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rupi, and very good morning to all delegates, Dr. Ashutosh Jani, all dear faculty members and dear students. Welcome to the fourth day of EFDP. On behalf of Anand Pharmacy College and SRKSM, we again would like to welcome you, all of you, at the fourth day of EFDP. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Ashutosh Jani. He is currently Head Clinical Operation Department, Vida Clinical Research, Ahmedabad. Dr. Ashutosh Jani had graduated from KB Institute of Pharmaceutical Education and Research, Gandhinagar, and he completed his MPharm and PhD in Pharmacology from LM College of Pharmacy, Gujarat University. Dr. Ashutosh had worked as a faculty under Gujarat University for a couple of years before he joined the clinical research industry. His journey started as a clinical research associate in the Clinical Trials Management Department and further moved to Medical Services and Business Development and Project Management Department at Lambda Therapeutic Research. He was closely associated with clinical trial audits and has managed several clinical trial studies and mentored several clinical research associates. At present, with over 18 years of experience in clinical research organization and pharma industry, he is currently working, as I already mentioned, as a head in clinical trial operation department at Vida Clinical Research. It's a premier CRO. He also holds secondary and tertiary qualification of PG Diploma in Management from NMIMS Mumbai and postgraduate certificate in project management and has 12 national and international publications to his credit. Today, Dr. Ashutosh will brief us about the clinical trial novel design aspects. I again would like to welcome and invite Dr. Ashutosh Jani to conduct this session. Sir, please.
Thank you, madam. Thank you for the introduction. And the screen is visible, Hardik?
Yes, madam.
Yeah,
yes, sir.
Yeah,
Perfect.
it's visible. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Just a minute. Okay, so very good morning, everyone, and thank you, madam, for the introduction. And it's definitely been an exciting day. And I was just talking with Hardik, and got to know, like, say, we have a marathon of lectures lined up, and all pretty much interesting, trying to cover all the domains associated with the design. So it's a really nice session put up altogether. I'm not sure if you all know, today is also a Thanksgiving Day we celebrate. So I would also like to extend my thank you to Dr. Tejal and the faculty team associated. And it's definitely a pleasure to be heard and getting the opportunity to talk with such an august audience. So we start off with the presentation. I'm not sure if you all know, like say, I've seen that there is certain sessions onto designing, design thinking. So I saw that there were pretty good sessions on design thinking also. So this is one of the incident which was there in US where what happened is, like say, we find very big number of cases, especially with respect to oncology and especially in children. So when it's a cancer and associated with children, I mean to say, handling them is a task in itself. So what was done is, like say, there was a team which was set up by the GE engineers who took this initiative. And there were teachers who were called up, there were painters, all, it was a team effort which was there. And the children were also asked, like say, what are the problems they face. It's typically scary for a child to enter into a CT scan room with noises all around, and you have to enter into that hole to get your CT scan done. And this being a routine affair for small children suffering from cancer, it was found that, I would say, this problem needs to be handled in a very delicate way. And the team came up with a really nice idea. They had this Pirates theme based CT scan machine, which was designed so that you just have to hold the shape and then you enter into the wheel of the shape and so on and so forth. So this typically was an instance of a really good design thinking when it comes to children and handling the issues with respect to small nitty-gritty like a scan for children. But like say, typically when we think of design, the first thing on our hand is our own cell phones, for that matter. So if we see that, like say, how the cell phones used to be, maybe in 2003-4 about, and then there was a revolution with Apple coming up with an iPhone, and that typically changed the way phones are designed now. And we all have now no keyboards. The keyboards are inbuilt, and say the next generation of all the phones which came subsequent to the first iPhone are all put up onto this platform. So the design per se definitely plays a vital role even in the our routine day-to-day activities also. What we plan to do is typically what our plan is, like say, we do have innovations coming up, but then like say when we think of a design, we still go back to the same old iconic, I mean, say the designs which were prevalent in the past. So there's not much which has been done onto these aspects, especially with respect to the design. So just quoting Don Berry, like say, we yet to experiment on the design, especially with respect to the clinical trial itself. So as mentioned by, say, Henry Ford, like, say, if I would have asked the people what they wanted, probably Ford would have come up with a faster horse rather than a car, for that matter. So it's definitely important that we look into the need of the hour and come up with the solution to mitigate that problem. So in today's session, what we plan to take up is I'll be touching upon certain aspects with respect to the design. So they say that, like, say, there are 5 whys, why, which you need to put up. So we'll try to see few of the W's. There are 5 W's. We'll try to see few of the W's, especially with respect to the design. So typically, whenever we are stuck up with a problem or a question in mind, we do use our logic to prove certain things, and definitely it's backed up by an intuition to discover something new. So what a good design would be doing is it helps you bridge between this logic and your intuition with a robust design in place. So with a good design, you'll be definitely be able to bridge the gap between the logic and your own intuition to come up with a better answer to the question. After why design is essential, we'll see what type of designs typically do we choose. So what happens, let's say, typically the type of design depends more onto the research question which we plan to target. Apart from that, the time and resources available, which plays a vital role, especially when choosing the right design. Obviously, the outcome of interest and the quality of data would equally be important, specifically when we want to get an answer to a particular question. Now, why this is important, specifically with respect to the current scenario, if we consider, then if you would see the current scenario of COVID, then there were drugs which have been repurposed, there were certain new drugs which have been introduced. And I would say, if you start watching from March, even if you take up any reputed journal, so what was true in March is not true in June, and what was true in June is not true in November. So things have definitely evolved in this short period of time. And why is this important is, like, say, if we see the scenario in India, like, say, there were drugs which have been given approval, like, say, itolizumab, which was typically for psoriasis, which was repurposed for COVID. The drug was just tested in 30 participants as a phase 2 study, and the drug regulators waived off the mandatory phase 3 requirement. But then, like, say, there were National Task Force for COVID, which came up, and they asked the company to provide more evidence on this drug. And the current state is, like, say, we hardly use this drug. On the same lines, like, say, there was large hue and cry about Patanjali coming up with Coronil as a herbal connotation, claiming to cure the COVID-19. However, like, say, the company began to advertise its claim, and then there was government which asked it to stop until there was further research which was done, which could validate the claim that it could be used to cure the COVID-19. So it may be typically used for a prophylactic, but then, like, say, when you claim certain things, you definitely need to back it with a robust data, a design, a study, well designed. On the same lines, there was Glenmark's favipiravir is one of the antiviral drugs. They just conducted the study in 150 patients, Whereas any typical phase 3 study, you all are aware, like say, that is at least more than 300 to 400 patients to start off the study. So this is how, I mean to say, the scenario was in India, but like you cannot blame just India for that matter, because that was typically the scenario all over. Because like say, even if you pick up the list of trials which have been conducted for this COVID scenario, if you analyze the data, there are about 201 studies which have been registered onto the CTRI, the global clinical trial.gov, and of which more than 87% was all based in China, and or 37 was in US, and only 8 products were typically a combination, either a combination products or a new product. So the rest, majority of them were either repurposed medicines, which are typically used for other viruses, malarias, autoimmune disease, or cancer for that matter. So although these randomized trials were there, but there were also non-randomized trial, which is definitely not a good design to go ahead with and generate the data, which would definitely not be acceptable onto the current standards. So what has happened is, like say, all these studies which we have seen over a period of time, right from say March to November, you will find that majority of the studies did not meet the expectations to treat COVID or to prevent COVID. So it takes less time to do it right than it takes to explain why it went wrong. So definitely there were probably the scenarios that I would say everyone was in a hurry to try and test whatever is available on the plate, and they tried to work around repurposed it and so on and so forth. But the result is, like say, in the current scenario and today when we are sitting, there is no typical drug which is approved or which can be used to treat the current COVID-19 situation. So definitely, I'm going to say this design flaws are there, and like say, definitely it needs to be thought on. So the choice of design which we plan is definitely should depend on the goal of the trial. And the choice also depends on the population and the knowledge of the intervention which we have at this point of time. And as I mentioned, like say, if the design is not proper, we may not be able to salvage the study or the data, and all the efforts and the money would all go in drain. I'm not sure like, if you've been through this quote. I'm going to say this is from Nature 2004. Like say, it's quite thought-provoking. If we buy a new refrigerator and it hurts 7% of the customers and it fails to work for another 1/3 of them, definitely the customers would expect refunds onto the refrigerator, and they would come and throw back into the showroom where they purchased it, right? But like say, the industry in which we work, we've been fortunate. We bring drugs to the market which are only 50% effective. I'm going to say just maybe handling or be useful for only 50% of the population. There are more side effects, and still, I'm going to say we tend to survive into the industry. Would have been any other white good industry, definitely would be thrown out with so many side effects and very less of an efficacy for that matter. So how this is, like say, the scenario in which we are, we just all waiting for the vaccine to come up. And the thing is, like say, the vaccines which have been there in the past, like say the flu vaccine, the effectiveness of the flu vaccine is hardly 40 to 60%. And similarly, on the lines, the MMR is definitely slightly better. But like say, we are, I mean, say the cutoff limit for the efficacy is just 50%. So if you are able to prove you're better as a vaccine candidate in more than 50%, you get a chance to market the drug in the country. However, I would say definitely things have improved over a period of time. And currently, like when we are talking, we're waiting for either Pfizer's or Moderna's vaccine to come up in across the world. Now they have proven efficacy of at least 90% or 95% efficacy is proven. But then, like say, that also leads to a question that, like say, what about those 5% who are not typically being able to respond to the vaccine? How would those people be handled? Because when you see from the global population, 5% is quite a large chunk of people. So typically, the backbone of any good study would be definitely a design, and definitely it should be following certain criterias, the basic ones to meet up to the requirement of a robust design and would arrive at the data. So patient-centric designs are definitely should be patient-centric. So whenever you are typically thinking of a study or a design or a drug, you should definitely keep the patient as your center of thought. Typically, whenever, like say, there are, like say, instances when such big companies they work on a strategy, they keep an empty chair. One chair is empty, which typically is regarded as the patient. So you have to have that empty chair in mind whenever you are formulating your strategies around any study or a drug or a molecule. You definitely need to have the end consumer or the end user in mind whenever you come up with a strategy. So definitely it should be patient-centric. There should be some say from the patient's point of view also. Because like say, if we see certain drugs, so they may be effective in as we saw in the previous cases, the efficacy rate may be very, very less. And the side effect profile may be equally high. But then, like say, the end user, I mean, say if it is the patient who is benefiting, or if the patient says that he's able to tolerate the side effects, but then this drug is improving the quality of life of that particular patient, then despite of whatsoever adverse effect or less efficacy it may be, it still stands a chance because there is a patient outcome which is being captured, and it shows that there is an improvement in the quality of life of the patient. So definitely these things are important, and especially the comparison, the randomization, the placebo. These are the few important aspects which definitely should be part of any robust design. So just to name a few, the fundamentals of design for majority of the studies would definitely be the choice of patient, or the choice of treatment, or the outcome which we plan to measure. Randomizing them in a proper fashion is equally important, and we need to ensure that there is a proper blinding so that there is less of bias. And choice of the number of participant is also equally important when you see the sample size. So as we were just mentioning something on to the design to be patient-centric. So that reminds me of one of the incidents in the other industry. I'm not sure if you are aware of Airbnb. So Airbnb is a typical a startup sort of where they give rooms. I mean, say if you have an empty room or an extra room in your house, you can offer that for bread. I mean, say it's bed and breakfast, B&B. So you can offer that as a room to other people who are probably traveling from the different part of the country or the world. So this Airbnb has this network where they get the information. Now what they saw is there were cases that, I mean, say there are certain group of people who are not allowing the visitors to for their particular place. So then they digged into the information, like what exactly was the problem. So what happens is, like, say there could be some elderly people who would be letting out a room, and there are, I mean, say certain people, young guys who probably just want to go and chill out with loud music and stuff like that. So those were the gaps. I mean to say, so when Airbnb went into the details and tried to search what exactly was the problem, then they came up with this host reflection taxonomy. And they did this detailed evaluation, and then, like, say whenever you want to get a room, there are a list of things which would be coming up to the host, that the person who is coming down is having these characteristics, and I mean, say based on that you can either allow or disallow a person. So that typically makes the survey is typically designed to be more centric towards the end user, and similarly we should be targeting things to the patient-centric efforts. And as we saw in the first instance where there was a CT scan, so the CT scan instance for GE, that is definitely a team effort. So I mean, say you cannot just, I mean, say GE engineers cannot just go in and get an CT scan build up. So they definitely needed the reviews from the patient. I mean, say those children who were there, what were they feeling, what happens when they entered into the CT scan room, why were they scared? It is an all dark room, and there was different sounds which are coming out, loud noises. So apart from that, they had this school teachers, the storytellers, and the painters, all put together were put up, and there was this design thinking efforts which were put up, and they came up with the solution of a CT scan for kids. So that typically involves all the stakeholders in the team is to be essentially needed when we come up with some design. So the foundation of a design, that reminds me of one of the incidents is like say Diwali was say just around the corner just a few days back, and because of the lockdown, like say, and the advancement in the color systems. So now we typically get those color which we can do it by ourselves, right? So they come up with different user-friendly colors. Means you don't need a professional person to color your wall. So just a single wall was to be painted. So I, like say on the same lines, just my neighbor also happened to have painted that piece of wall. So as a good neighbor, I just I went there and asked them, like, say, how many tints of this color did you buy? And they said, we got 6 tins of the color. I said, fair enough. I went to the market, got another 6 tins of color, and tried to color up the wall. The wall was colored appropriately. However, then, like, there were 2 tins of color which remained. So I went back to the neighbor and I asked them, like, say, I have 2 tins of color which is remaining. And they typically said, oh, that happened to you too? And say, you too got 2 extra colors? And that reminded me that it was not their fault. It was typically my fault that I asked the wrong question. Instead of asking how many tins of color you brought, I would have asked how many you used. So asking the right question is definitely important. So if you ask the right question, you design your study accordingly, then only you will be able to get up the right answer from the data. So for that, we definitely need a control group which we need to compare against our standard of our treatment or our standard of care. So why do we need a comparative study is typically is that the grass on the other side of the fence is always greener. So we go with that mindset and we try to compare. So you should definitely have something against which you would like to put up your drug on. Maybe it may be as good as the other, or it may be equal to or superior. So that's the typical way in which we would like to have the comparison. So that's the reason I mean to say it's definitely essential to have an arm where you try to typically compare. The usual choice of these control groups are the available standard care or the standard therapy which are there. And definitely we need to take into consideration the design aspect with respect to when we select the control group and the ethical issues, if at all, associated with the use of a control group. So the control group is definitely essential, and it helps in inference from the trial, whatever data which we get. It helps in evaluating the data, and it adds on to the ethical acceptability of the trial, because when you're comparing it against the standard of care or the available best treatment, so that gives an heads-on comparison. It also typically helps in reducing the bias, because I mean, say you may be comparing with a substandard drug that could add on to the bias. But then, like, say, what is the best standard of care and the best drug available? If you try to compare with that, and that would definitely avoid this bias. And the subjects type would also remain the same. So we have the same population being exposed to both the comparator arm as well as the treatment arm. So this typically adds on to the credibility of the results as well as the kind of endpoint which we are looking at. So these things essentially makes the use of a control arm really important. Now, there are a use of placebo arms in the study, and the placebo arms are well documented to be effective, and there could be no treatment plus and placebo, or a standard of care plus and placebo, or you could have a matched placebo, so that we avoid the bias. The first treatment on that end was way back, maybe more than centuries ago, where they started a treatment for vitamin C for common cold. and there they used a placebo arm to ensure that you are comparing it with no treatment. There are references available where it was typically randomized controlled trials are used way back in 1976, and this is still regarded as a gold standard. So you try to compare these studies with in a randomized fashion with a control group present. So what typically happens, the problem with randomized controlled trials is the usual data is uh, not generalizable. It's generalizable data. The subject may not represent the general population, because let's say what we try to see is we try to select the best population which could be producing the effect. So that's the case. We tend to be more biased towards that. And the recruitment disadvantages, like say you need twice as many as new patients typically you would have in case of a non-randomized study. So because of this, the sample size and the cost, etc., would also increase. And there are certain problems with the physicians also. So they say that I would not like to randomize this patient to this treatment arm or the other treatment arm. And similarly, there could be a patient who could, you could say that I would not like to be randomized to a placebo arm or the other treatment arm. So these are the different challenges which are typically faced with randomized studies also. So just to prevent the bias and the false positives, it is essential to have it on the randomized way. Now, there are certain issues definitely with respect to randomization also, that like statistically, clinically, the trial must be showing some benefit because of this. And usual the ethics is like say the doctors would they think that I mean say the patient should be getting the best care, I mean say the available treatment. So the doctor may ethically say that I mean say I am not able to give the best treatment when I put up the patient in the trial, and because the doctor is also not aware where the patient would be coming into which study arm. So despite the doctor knowing the best treatment, and he would not be able to govern the arm of the treatment. So these typically lays some ethical issues when we consider randomization in the trials. As we were seeing, like say, this is one of the reported study where patient engagement, as I mentioned, things should be more patient-centric from the patient's perspective. Things should be done. So this was a study where the doctor typically would take up the intake and say what is your vitals and just get the data. There'll be no treatment which would be given to these patients. And in the second arm, they would take in the data, but then they used to give a placebo. And there was no engagement with the patient. Just take the data, give a drug, and that's it. And the third instance was you take the data, you give a placebo, but there is an engaged care. So you talk with the patient, there's an interaction, a good level of interaction with the study nurse or the doctor. They try to explain various aspects of the treatment, the drug, and these engaged interactions, what it led to is these engaged interaction, when things were more onto the patient-centric way, then just the intake would produce results in nearly 28% of the 28 cases. And then, like say, when you compare it, like say, with the placebo and no engagement, it was still, I mean, say the patients are all receiving just no treatment or a placebo, and still you find that there is an improvement in their result as compared to the previous results. So the environment definitely plays an important role. So this is the typically case that what happens is, if we are going through a dark night and in a snake forest, so even if we come across a small stick in the forest, we would think it as it's a snake. So the brain would be tuned in to think only about the snakes, because we've been knowing that this is a snake forest, this is a snake forest. So this environment in which the patients are, that definitely plays a vital role. And so whatever the thought processes are, they typically would produce the results. On the same lines, there was another experiment also, which was repeated, where they just changed the name. I mean to say, there was just the name which was modified or changed. So this was a migraine drug, Mexalt, and the patient received a placebo. However, the placebo was labeled as Mexalt, which was the drug for migraine. And the other group, like say, Mexalt was given, but it was labeled as placebo. So it was just the vice versa. And in the third treatment arm, it was the drug, and it was labeled as the drug itself, Mexalt. And the result is, like say, the percentage of reduction in pain, if we consider. So despite giving them no treatment, there was a 30% reduction in the pain. And when you compare it with the drug was given, but however it was just labeled that it is a placebo. So that thought process goes into the mind, and we see that despite giving the drug, there was only 38% reduction in pain. However, when you change the name to the drug, and you mentioned that you are giving the drug treatment, there was a drastic reduction in the pain. So these aspects also needs to be taken into consideration whenever we typically see a study being positioned or in question. Same was a typical case in Parkinson's disease. So what they did is the carbidopa-levodopa treatment, which was typically being given to the Parkinson's patient. So then they do a neuronal correlation scan and correlation with respect to the placebo. So there's a baseline scan. The treatment was stopped for a certain period of time. And after a certain period of time, again, there was no treatment. It was just a placebo which was being given. And when again the scans were repeated, it was found that there was a 200% increase in the dopamine concentration, which was typically compared to 250 milligrams of levodopa just by no treatment. So this typically tells us that there is a pharmacy in all of us. I mean, say we are all having different levels of drugs inbuilt in us, which typically are prepared or released at the time when it is needed. So this experiments typically wonders the importance of a placebo arm, because like say, even if we don't give treatment, there are definitely good amount of responses which have been seen in the patients. without getting any treatment. So what the world is moving towards, I mean, say we are moving towards an age of bionics. Bionics are, I mean, say we are typically integrating machines with the body. So there are definitely now instances where we have people with amputated legs walking on artificial legs, or similarly on the same case with hands, and all typically functioning maybe far better than a normal human leg or a hand, because we typically age I mean, say the body wear and tears. However, I mean, say these bionic limbs or bionic arms, they just get an upgrade. So they typically improve over a period of time as compared to the normal natural leg or a hand. So the purpose of this is, like, say we are changing, and so should be the designs in which we work, the trials which we conduct. They should definitely be also changing over a period of time. However, what has happened is, like, say if you consider the electronics age, I was just reading through, there was a case, like, say we all have been through, like, say there were previously Pentium processors, like, say we had P1, P2, P3, P4, and so on and so forth, right? So, and now, like, say we have moved on to a different processor platform where we have octa-core and all those stuff. So what has happened is, like, say these industries, apart from the typical pharma industry for that matter, has grown tremendously. And one of the reason, if we try to evaluate, is they have grown just because they had this decision making which was really quick. I mean to say, like, say they typically wanted to fail fast. So what happens is, like, say you bring a thing in the market, it fails, and then you get a better one, it fails. So what has happened is, like, say this failure over a period of time has say they do the experiment, they realize that this is not working, it fails, they come up with something else. So that's how they have grown over a period of time, which is not the case when we typically considered our type of a setup or a design. So we typically would stick on to that particular molecule, drug, but then, like, say we would not like to move on from one particular molecule, which is not the case with the other industries which are there. So they respect this failure and they try to improve upon those aspects, which is not the case with the clinical trials. So would have been we able to gauge that the drug is not working, or there is a problem, we would definitely would have improved upon those things. That's what the basic need for a design should be. So now what has happened is, like, say we have come up with this new thing, which is adaptive design. So what happens is, like, say people now go for these type of design structures which are adaptive. So why go for an adaptive design? So because it's typically a key to all my research questions. So whatever problem I have, I could solve it with an adaptive design. And what happens, like, say that's what the first response is, like, say my research, I have found that whatever the problem, I get it solved, and I'm ready to go with this adaptive design and fix the problem, whatever the case may be. Whatever the problem I had before, I'll be able to fix it. Say I need a sample size of 200 and I'm not able to go to that number. Let's make it adaptive. Let's go with 50. And then I just politely say, based on the situation, gravity of the situation, may add on certain subjects or may change on certain things. So these type of design, or what they do is they add on flexibility. So a good design that statisticians have typically been selfish. They've never told that you could also go with an adaptive design. So they had kept it to themselves. But now, like, the thing is, like, say, there are many studies and many things which have been uh, undergone through this adaptive design. And the adaptive design is defined as a clinical trial design that allows for prospectively planned modification. The word prospective is important because you need to plan ahead. You cannot plan at a later stage. So you can modify to these aspects of the design based on the data which you have gathered over a period of time, and you could make the changes, alterations in the study. So that's what flexibility this design comes up with, the adaptive design. So there are various elements with respect to the FDA adaptive design, and they have taken into consideration all the various possible scenarios. So whatever the case may be, let's say there could be a group sequential design. So in this type of design where we do an interim analysis. So we stop in between, we gather all the data, we try to see what works, what doesn't work, and proceed accordingly. And there could be adaptations in the sample size. Like, say, we reevaluate the data, and we come up that, okay, these many subjects are not meeting the criteria, so we need additional subjects to be enrolled for the study, and then we add on more subjects to this trial. Or there could be adaptation into the patient population. For example, like, say, we are enrolling patients of metastatic breast cancer. Now, when we see the drug is typically not working in a subset of patients, like, say, patients who are, say, ER positive or PR positive or ER-PR positive or triple negative breast cancer. So then we decide, okay, we enrolled all the patients of metastatic breast cancer, but then over a period of time, we found that there could be there needs to be a change in the patient population. So we need to enroll only, say, triple negative breast cancer patients who could be adapted to this drug. So there you have an adaptation to the patient population. So you could adapt and enrich the population. Similarly, there could be adaptation to the treatment arm. Like, say, you are having various drugs, drug A, B, C, and then you find that, okay, if you add on this drug D to A, it may probably be a better way to work around. So there you get a choice to add a study arm. There could be adaptation to the patient allocation. As we mentioned, like, say, there are certain disease which can be classified onto the molecular level, like, say, lung cancer. Then you have small cell lung cancer, non-small cell lung cancer. So the drug may be working only in a subset of the cancer, maybe a non-small cell lung cancer, and it may not be producing the required effect in a small cell lung cancer. So the patient allocation could also be changed accordingly. There could be an adaptation to the endpoint selection. So previously we would have selected that this is what the endpoint we are working for, that there should be a reduction in glucose level by, say, 10 milligram per deciliter. But then, like, say, we find that this is not typically happening, or this is not a good indicator, and then we change it to say HB1AC. So the endpoint could be tweaked or changed. There could be adaptation to multiple design features. So there could be combination of all the above, I mean to say, in various permutation combination, which could also be possible. So all these typically would add on to the different adaptive designs which are possible. So theoretically, it definitely looks really promising thing. And it's not just theoretically, but we have various studies are also being now conducted typically onto this new adaptive design. So what is this? This is an hypothetical scenario where we consider that you design and power a study on a research topic with limited prior information. So when we start, we have very less information available, but then during the course of time, we gather more additional information, and then we would like to change the course of time. So the study is being conducted and observed effect is smaller than expected, but it is still meaningful. So if we consider that, like say, there is a small amount of reduction in HB1AC, but still it's a clinically significant reduction, but the amount of patient you need to prove it would be on a larger end. So then you add on patient. So you adapt to the sample size. You start off with say 50 subjects, and then gradually add on another 50 or another 150, so that your criteria is typically met. But as I mentioned, these things need to be done a priori. It should not be that you decide afterwards and change the course of the study. So as the study has been conducted, the observed treatment effect is smaller than expected, but still meaningful, and you change the course. And if we maintain a planned sample size, as we may be underpowered to detect the differences, there you could add on to more number of subjects or more number of patients to meet this requirement. So this is a highly flexible model, and it helps you in taking decisions with respect to the new information which you have gathered over a period of time. Sample size re-estimation, if we see, let's say if we see that we use an interim estimate, we can address the prior uncertainties about the treatment effect size. Say we start off with say 10,000 people, and we'll see in the next example, like say there could be that some may work, some may not work. So based on that, we re-estimate the numbers and come up with the revised numbers and include the enrollment. So these can be blinded or unblinded type of studies, and FDA typically recommends steps should be taken whenever we are doing this re-establishment of sample size during the adaptive stages of the study. This is one typical example, like say when there was a platelet inhibition with cangrelor, which was the drug, and that was leading to ischemia events. So the study was powered to get the ratio of say 5.1 versus the study arm. So they enrolled nearly 11,000 patients to get a power of 85% and an alpha of 0.05. So unblinded sample size, the estimates planned after 70% enrollment, they saw through the data, and there was an interim analysis, and early stopping was done because the efficacy point was already achieved, boundary was crossed. So you did not enroll so many patients for the study because your objective for the events was already met with the 70% of the enrollment. So you did not need to increase the sample size. The other cases are typically enriching the patient population. So this idea of adapting the patient population, adaptive enrichment, we'll be going to consider like sort of a hypothetical scenario where we might say that why I want to get my patient population for my study. So let's assume that we have a hypothetical scenario where we are enrolling yellow smiley faces and purple smiley faces. So we expect the between these two individuals, the yellow smiley faces actually have some more meaningful or strong benefit to this intervention than the purple smiley faces. And so the one approach which we might is that we see here that we may rethink that the case, and we may be not sure like whether should we enroll these type of other patients for the study or no, the purple ones. So because there was no typical efficacy which was being seen in these patients. So like if we start enrollment with both the yellow as well as the purple faces, then we do an interim analysis to determine if we should continue the enrollment in the overall population or we should restrict the future enrollment to just the targeted population. So then we have two scenarios, like say we may either continue the enrollment or we may be restricting the enrollment to the subpopulation. So then we continue the enrollment or we may restrict to only yellows because yellow is what is typically producing the effect. So this the reason for such population enrichment typically could be we want information about both the targeted as well as non-targeted subpopulation. Then we would like to continue. And uncertain about the treatment effect of non-targeted subpopulation, that is perhaps the treatment is not as effective or less effective, but still maybe clinically meaningful, then we would have gone with this and can provide greater power. So just to add on to the power to the fixed sample size without enrichment, that is if we restrict the enrollment, we'll have more subpopulation observation versus having equivalent power. So when we come to know that only the yellows are responding, we will be able to complete the study with lesser number of subjects. So the power would be maintained. The next type of designs which are currently are the seamless designs. If you see the studies which have been conducted recently, all the vaccine studies for that matter, all the Pfizer's, AstraZeneca, the Moderna vaccine studies, they have been a seamless design. So what happens in a seamless study design is that there's an idea typically of a traditional trial process. We have multiple stage of development. Maybe we have a distinct preclinical, then we have a phase 1, then a phase 2, phase 3, and then it goes on to the data and we go on to the market. That's the typical way in which the normal study designs used to work. But now instead of a separate phase 1 and a phase 2, you do a seamless phase 1 and to the trial, and similarly you seamlessly progress on to a phase 3 design, where you seamlessly go from a phase 2 to a phase 3 without having to stop the trial or develop entirely new infrastructure or do entirely new design in this process. So in this process, we generally undergo to rely again onto the idea that some of the interim analysis or the analysis we are going to make some decision out of the treatment arms, and the arms have been included our study, and we'll see our different examples where they typically done this seamless type of design. So there is a movement from one phase to another seamlessly without stopping. So that's what the basic purpose is. The disadvantage typically are logistic challenges at times, and maintaining the statistical powers and the properties is typically a problem which is encountered. So as I was just mentioning, like say one version of seamless phase 2, phase 3 designs is they typically have this diagram. If you could see that there are 3 treatments in a phase 2, the red pill, the violet pill, the purple pill, and the green pill. Then you do a progression-free survival. You do an analysis after a phase 2, and you find that the purple pill doesn't work. So then you continue with, you drop the purple pill and you just continue with a red pill and a green pill and prove the efficacy of the both the drugs. So this is typically a seamless type of a phase 2, phase 3 design, where we continue the treatment for the drug which is showing some efficacy. As we saw this seamless design, on the same lines we have this multi-arm, multi-stage design. So what would happen is, like say, we one version of this phase 2, phase 3 seamless design is, as we've seen in this illustrated diagram, that we start off with all, I mean, say the orange, violet, green, purple, and red. And then when we progress, we see that certain are not meeting the criteria. So those are typically dropped, and the rest which are typically meeting the criteria, like say progression-free survival, then they would be continued to the next phase, the next level. So this we typically call as the multi-arm, multi-stage design, and this is a typical seamless design where we transit from phase 2 to a phase 3 seamlessly. We also have this covariate adaptive randomization, which is typically done to consider the if there is any covariates which are applicable or any randomization. The response outcome of these adaptive designs is the assigned probabilities are modified based on the observed response or the outcomes, and there's motivation to allocate as many patients as possible to the best treatment arm. And the recent studies have identified that outcome adaptive randomization may result in the randomization to an inferior arm, and concerns are raised with respect to the sample size imbalance. So this is a typical example based on which this response adaptive randomization is taken up. So wherever you are getting a response, you typically randomize the patient onto that particular arm. So it's more of a winner design. So whoever wins, let me say the patient is randomized to that particular design. As I mentioned, like say we have this master protocol designs which are there. So what these master protocols are done is, so there is one master protocol to this multiple therapies or multiple disease or both the scenarios, whatever the case may be. So traditionally we have conducted separate standalone studies for most of this few interventions in the targeted population. Like say we may be studying the effect of say docetaxel in lung cancer, or it may be seeing in breast cancer, and these are all different indications in which we'll be targeting one particular drug. But with a master protocol in place, what happens is, like say, there'll be multiple therapies or multiple disease. Both you will be targeting with just one protocol. So that we typically call it as a master protocol design. So this was the master protocol innovation was from this Woodcock and Lavench. So they typically describe the areas where there is this scope for innovation, especially when we use this master protocol, because at times the sites don't have that infrastructure to meet on to the requirements of this master protocol, or there are no platforms available for screening of such based on, because we'll be going on with the biomarker setup, or there could be trial networks which could be developed which could help in the enrollment, or the adaptive design as we are already seeing it. So these all aspects are the innovations with respect to the master protocol. And under this master protocol, we have these three different types of studies. We call them as umbrella. Umbrella is to study the multiple target therapies in context with the single disease. So we select a disease, a single disease, and we try to target the different therapies onto that particular disease. Like say, for example, COVID is one disease, and we target multiple target therapies which could be effective in a case of a scenario like COVID. The basket is to study the single target therapy and in context to the multiple disease or the disease subtypes. As like say, for example, we are using one drug and we are targeting this one drug to various diseases. Like say docetaxel, we are targeting it also to lung cancer, we are also targeting it to breast cancer, we are also targeting it to head and neck cancer, and so on and so forth. So there will be just one single target therapy, and there will be multiple diseases which we'll be targeting with just one therapy. So that is typically a basket type of a trial design. And we have a platform type of trial design in which we study multiple target therapies in the context of a single disease, and perpetual manner with the therapies allowed to enter or leave the platform on the basis of the decision algorithm. So we start, and then like say at one station, like say as we have on a train, a platform, the train starts from one place, and then there are people who go down who are not able to continue further. They get down at the next station, and similarly and so forth. There will be new people who will be adding on to the next station, and they may get down at another station. So it's more like a platform. The drug train starts from one station with all the possible therapies. Which therapies don't work, they get down at the next station, and those new therapies which could work would get on from the next station. They would continue up to wherever they are effective. So this typical design is regarded as a platform design. So these type of designs are also undertaken by in the current scenarios. So the advantages, if you could see, it definitely brings on a tremendous advantage when we come to cost saving. So these master protocols and the designs per se, they definitely help in reducing the overall cost of the study, and the time and the cost associated with taking the decision and going further. So this typically summarizes what do we mean to say with respect to an umbrella or umbrella type of a study. So it's a typical chart summarizing the study designs. So the typical advantages are, like say, we have relatively small sample size, and there is increased hit rate by enrolling patients with rare molecular features across tumor types, and obviously offer an array of novel therapeutic agents to a broad group of patients who may benefit. And the disadvantages are more onto the prognostic heterogeneity associated with the tumor. So based on the genetic structure, the tumor may be different, and there'll be single arm or sub studies generally would be required for a tumor response rate or an endpoint. So multiple testing is also challenging, and that's the typical disadvantage. We can skip this. It's a longer duration of study. So as I mentioned, the study continues for a longer period. So that's the typical problem when we come to the master protocol design. There are studies which have been conducted with this type of protocol. So it was a typical phase 2 endpoint was progression-free survival. So they start off with, say, about 68 to 124 patients in the sub-study, and then they seamlessly transition from a phase 2 to a phase 3 endpoint, and they change from the endpoint from progression-free survival to overall survival. And they add on more patients, so it's about 272 to about 336 patients per sub-study are added, and no cohort comparison is there. And then initially there is no match patients with compared to the immunotherapy or the standard of care. And then, like say, they do this biomarker. This is the study name, lung map, and the patients with previously treated advanced squamous cell lung cancer, they were enrolled. And initially it was a 3 parallel study, randomized phase 2, phase 3, and sub-trial for targeted therapy versus the standard of care. So that was what the initial thing was. And then the goal was to get about 500 to 1,000 patients screened per year. And then they add on a new cohort, the non-match study for the patient not eligible for the cohort. So there are drugs and molecules which have been targeted through this novel protocol design. So this is what we were seeing. So there are PD-L1 resistant patients. So this is an example of umbrella. So especially in case of non-small cell lung cancer, where there is this EGFR mutation. So there are typical drugs which are targeted to only either KRAS mutation or EGFR mutation. So there would be drugs which you cannot typically use for lung cancer, but only in specific subgroup of lung cancer where you have this mutation in either this EGFR gene or KRAS gene. So this was possible with respect to using this umbrella type of design. So there are practical issues. You need good collaboration. There could be adaptations, and changes could happen over a period of years. And we may encounter statistical issues also with respect to the effective size, the sample size, whether to include all the markers, remove the other markers for the subgroup, and so on and so forth. So they are typical potential solutions to this challenge of precision medicine, because gradually now we are moving from this scenario to personalized medicine, where the drug need to be precisely acting on a particular subset of a disease or subset or gene of the disease. So it is expected to increase in popularity over a period of time, these type of designs, and they are more common with rare molecular subtypes, specifically like say lung cancer for that matter. Okay. As we mentioned, like say there are other studies also, like to name a few. One was them for Ebola virus outbreak when it was there. There was a Prevail study, and there is an Ebola MCM study. So these studies have also been conducted on the platform design. As I mentioned, like, so there'll be a candidate which would be boarding the station and then getting off the station where it's not effective, and new candidate would be boarding onto the next station. So this is what there was no known candidate therapies or vaccine, and then over a period of time they conducted this platform design, and with this they were able to get the best possible vaccine. So based on the learnings, what happens in the first segment or the second segment, we move on to the next level and try to see the best possible outcome for our question. So should we consider an adaptive design or no? So that's more onto the study question which you are targeting. It definitely has its own advantages and challenges. So the greatest advantages with respect to the flexibility and efficiency with respect to the resource, financial, because it's in long run cost less as compared to the other studies design, and a greater statistical power is possible if you go with an adaptive design, and it improves your ability to answer broader questions that may be refined as a trial progresses. The challenges definitely are there. So you need an advanced analytical methods to avoid these type 1 errors. Moreover, you need to gain in the efficiency because then you are sacrificing your alpha and you need to add on more patients. Logistic is also challenging. So as I mentioned, like say, you need to sacrifice your alpha, the power, and the FDA allows these type of adaptive designs, but they come up with a proper planning, and things should be planned a priori, all the scenarios, and this should be that it should not ensure that your study is underpowered. And prior specification could be challenging because, like say, when we initially start, we may not have all the scenarios in place. So at times it becomes quite challenging that what to do, when to do. So those things, if it's are not clear a prior, then the design per se fails. So as I mentioned, there are increased number of survivors, and there is a huge impact onto these study costs and timelines, specifically when we use this master protocol. It's more used in case of oncology, and its use is gradually increasing over a period of time. Okay, so that's it from my end. I hope I have not crossed the timeline.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, sir, for delivering such a wonderful and informative session. As you rightly said, that backbone of any study would be selection of robust design, and the design needs to be patient-centric. So thank you once again for acquainting us with the various aspects of design in clinical trial. We have a few of the questions from the participants. That I would like to put forth. One of the question is, taking into considerations all the inclusion and exclusion criteria, what challenges do CROs face while enrolling the patient for any trial?
So yeah, I'm going to say the inclusion exclusion criteria are definitely challenging, and what happens is, like say, all the studies typically require an ideal patient pool. So if you're doing a study, you don't want that the say, like for example, if you're doing a study on say diabetes, then you would restrict your patient population to say a typical blood sugar level or a typical HbA1c. You will not have you would not like to have other comorbid conditions like say diabetes in hypertension in place, or other cardiac complications, etc. So what the typical studies may be a phase 2, phase 3, they look for a clean population, and that typically is at times difficult to get. So the screening rates are screen failure rates are on a higher end. So we need to probably screen more patients to get onto the study. So it's definitely challenging. The way to mitigate is like say we typically take use of registries which are there, which typically are listing down patients, different patients pool, and we could take advantage of different registries which are available. Certain sites are well equipped. They maintain their strong patient pool database. I mean, say they have various information. So if I walk into their center and I say that I am looking for a study on say triple negative breast cancer, so then they'll be able to filter out and tell that I have 100 ongoing patients of only triple negative breast cancer. I'm not talking of breast cancer in general. I'm just being very specific to a subset of cancer. So yeah, there is been challenging, but yeah, there are different means through which we try to mitigate this challenge and overcome them.
Thank you. Thank you for responding to the query. We have one more question. How much it is necessary to use placebo during clinical trials? Are there any conditions in which its use can be avoided?
Typically, it's definitely essential to have a placebo arm in place, and they usually avoid in certain scenarios where you may say you are sure that your drug is going to produce the effect. But as we saw in the presentation, that without the treatment also the body has its own mechanism through which it tries to heal itself, and that's the reason it's essential to have a placebo arm in place. Coming to this current COVID vaccine also, they would say it's definitely a sure shot, but still they have a placebo arm in place for this vaccine study also. Typically in the prior scenario when we used to develop vaccine like say mumps and measles type early age vaccine, there where typically was sure shot, they never used a placebo arm. But in the current scenario with the COVID vaccine also, they have a placebo arm in place. So it's definitely a vital part of any clinical trial design.
Thank you, sir. One more question. The storage condition for the COVID Pfizer vaccine is quite critical. So how the government will navigate and manage through this?
Yeah, it's that's what we tried to touch upon, was more on to be more patient centric. Now, what the scenario is, like say the Moderna vaccine and this vaccine, Pfizer vaccine, they never thought of from that point of view with respect to the storage and transportation, which was not the case with Oxford. The Oxford is like say the UK-based university which have developed this Oxford vaccine. So their storage conditions are, I would say, the typical temperate zone conditions where it's easy to maintain and get an idea about I would say easy to carry forward the dosing, etc. So the other vaccines which require a -80 storage conditions, that would definitely be a challenge, because the cold chain maintenance is definitely of grave importance, and it would definitely be challenging for all these companies. Oxford had thought on that, and before coming into the market, so they have their storage conditions at 2 to 8, which is a normal storage condition, which is possible in any other scenario. However, the Moderna vaccine and other vaccines, they have it as -80. minus 80 requires, I mean, say dry ice or a minus 80 deep freezer, etc., to take care of their storage conditions, which will be typically really difficult to get on from, especially into a country like India, where we are densely populated, and storage conditions itself is quite challenging in the temperate region. So yeah, it would definitely be a challenge for all of us. And there are depots, warehouses which have been set up by these various companies. So they are doing their best to set up this small warehouses with this facility where they can store this over a period of time.
Thank you, sir. And once again, on behalf of entire Anand Pharmacy College fraternity, I thank you for accepting our invitation and delivering such a wonderful session.
Thank you all. Thank you for being a good audience, and thank you.
Thank you. Now.